is God like? I suppose you don't need to be a theologian to ask that question. It's one of the most basic questions of all. Is God like Zeus, angry, throwing thunderbolts at earth? Is he like Ganesh, the elephant-headed god of Hinduism? Is he that bearded old man sitting on a cloud? Is God the absent clockmaker of Thomas Jefferson and the 18th century deists? Deists believe that God created the cosmos, wound it up just like a clock, and then left it to unwind all by itself. And since then he's been hands off. As Christians, we claim to know what God is like. Very simply, God is like Jesus. As one young child said, Jesus is God out in the open. That indeed is the testimony of the New Testament scriptures. In the New Testament book of Hebrews, in chapter 1, we are told, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. In other words, God has spoken in the past through the Old Testament heroes of faith and through their prophets, but nothing like this. Jesus is God out in the open, the exact representation of his being. St. Paul, when he writes to the church at Colossae, the Son is the image of the invisible God. In John's Gospel, we read of Philip, the disciple, saying to Jesus, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip, even after I've been among you for such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? In her famous song, Joan Osborne asks the question, what if God were one of us? Well, the Christian answer is very clear. God is one of us. His name is Jesus. Matthew in his Gospel refers to Jesus as Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Jesus is the definitive answer to the question of what God is like. God is like Jesus. But in which way does Jesus reveal God to us? Well, how long have you got? Read the 4 Gospels, find out for yourselves. Basically, Jesus reveals to us what God is like through his actions and through his words. But, I hear you say, is there any decisive moment in his life in which he demonstrates what God is like? Yes. It has to be the story of Easter, the crucifixion, God on a cross, which has become the universal symbol of Christianity. The place where sin is forgiven, where the world is set right, and where God is fully revealed. Of course, as Paul makes it clear, a cross without an empty tomb, where God defeats sin and the grave is no victory at all. But when you think of it, at face value, this might sound just a little bit strange. We worship a crucified God. Now, most other religions more or less worship some version of a powerful, glorious, triumphant God, but Christians worship a God who allows himself to be betrayed, tortured, and crucified. Paul, when he took the Christian message into Greece, acknowledged that his message was Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. And you can understand why. The Jews believed that anyone who hung on a tree was cursed. Cursed, not blessed. So how could this be God? The non-Jews thought this message was utter nonsense, that the God who created all things was this Galilean who died naked and humiliated on a Roman cross in apparent weakness and shame. The message just didn't seem to make sense. Foolishness, scandalous. But there's another question. What does Jesus dying on a cross tell us about the God that he came to reveal? Well, American pastor theologian Brian Zand, in his thought-provoking book Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God, writes these words. He says, above all things, the cross is, as the definitive moment in Jesus' life, is the supreme revelation of the very nature of God. At the cross, Jesus does not save us from God. At the cross, Jesus reveals God as Saviour. The cross is where God receives the most vicious blow of human sin, turns the other cheek and forgives. The world says, crucify. God says, forgive. Paul writes, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself. Coming back to that question, what does Jesus, in the most definitive moment of his earthly ministry, reveal to us about God? Well, actually many things. Divine love, unconditional forgiveness, sacrifice, self-giving, humility, servanthood, a God who came not to be served but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And we are going to reflect on some of these revelations over the next couple of weeks. However, for this morning, I want to focus on the God who suffers with us. There are a number of occasions when Scripture encourages us that God is not aloof and that God experiences the pain that his people are experiencing. When the nation suffered as slaves in Egypt, we are told that God saw their plight and heard their groaning, and that in their distress, he too was distressed. In the time of the judges, when Israel was oppressed by foreigners, we are told that Yahweh could not bear Israel's misery any longer. And through the prophets, he reminds them, I have loved you with an everlasting love, and asks them to, if it is possible for a mother to forget the baby at her breast, quickly adding, though she may forget, I will not forget you. And throughout the Old Testament, we find those moments when God reveals his enduring love to his people. But the most awesome example of God's love, a love that suffers and understands the suffering of his people, is not found in the pages of the Old Testament. It is found on the cross at Calvary. The Jewish writer Eliezer, or Elie Wiesel, wrote a powerful book called Night, in which he tells the story of his childhood experiences in a Nazi death camps of Auschwitz and Buna and Buchenwald. He was not quite 16 in the spring of 1944 when the Gestapo arrived to deport all Jews from his little town in Romania. On arrival at Auschwitz, the men and women were segregated, and Elie never saw his mother or sister again. In the book, he describes in harrowing detail the sufferings of the inmates at the camp. Perhaps the most awful experience of all was when the guards first tortured and then hanged a young boy. Just before hanging, Elie heard someone behind him whisper, "Where is God? Where is he?" Thousands of prisoners were forced to watch the hanging. It took the little boy half an hour to die. And then they were compelled to march past, looking at the dead boy full in the face. Behind him, Elie heard the same voice asking, "Where is God now?" It was experiences like these that led a young group of learned Jews in Buchenwald to put God on trial for neglecting his chosen people. And in this mock trial, witnesses were produced for both the prosecution and defense, but the case for the prosecution was overwhelming. The judges were the rabbis. They found the accused guilty and they solemnly condemned him. Where was God in Buchenwald or Auschwitz or Ukraine? Where was he when the Russians invaded, indiscriminately killing men, women and children, young and old? Where was he in Turkey and Syria in that devastating earthquake in the last couple of weeks? Or last week in Malawi when the cyclone caused whole villages to be washed away? The question of suffering is perhaps the most poignant of all. How many times have we asked that question? Why? If not out loud, then perhaps quietly in our hearts. We might have said, if there is an all-loving, all-powerful God, then why do these things happen? Why does he allow them to happen? And many people have attempted to answer that question philosophically, theologically, pastorally. Some religions have their answers. Some have viewed human suffering as punishment sent by God. This kind of idea is actually very common today. I'm sure you've heard people say, "What have I done to deserve this?" Some have simply walked away from their faith in protest of a God who appears to stay safely in heaven and refuses to have anything to do with those who are suffering around him. Coming back to the story of that dreadful hanging in the concentration camp and the question of an anonymous spectator asking, "Where is God now?" Well, I didn't finish that story. Elie Wiesel recounts how when he heard that question, he heard another voice deep within him answering, "Where is he? He is here. He is hanging on these gallows." The suffering of Jesus on a cross does not explain human suffering, but it does reveal a God as willing and able to be subjected to all the pain and suffering that this world experiences. It was Dr. John Stott who once wrote, "I could never myself believe in a God if it were not for the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it?" I've entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of Buddha, his legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, a ghost of a smile playing around his mouth, a remote look on his face detached from the agonies of this world. But each time, after a while, I have had to turn away, and in my imagination I have turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross, nails through his hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from the thorn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. This is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh and blood and tears and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become more manageable in the light of his. Our sufferings become more manageable in the light of his. Essentially, what John Stott is saying is, God knows. He has been tested in every way that you are being tested right now. He's not aloof. He's not detached. He's not disinterested. But he is the God who is touched by our infirmities. He is the one who weeps at his friend's graveside, the one who sits where we sit, the one who feels our pain. The writer to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament writes, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who is ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to feel sympathy for our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin." Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. In other words, he knows. He has experienced all that we go through in life, tested and tempted in every way that we are. And because he has been through all of that, we can approach God's throne with confidence. He not only sympathizes, but he can empathize with us. You see, in this place of suffering, we are promised to find grace and mercy in our time of need. He entered our world and our pain and sits beside us in the lowest places of our lives. Jesus experienced excruciating pain, slowly suffocating to death, but his suffering went further than that. It wasn't only the pain, but the deep sense of abandonment by God. On the cross he cried, my God, why have you forsaken me? God, where are you?" For many people, their experience of physical suffering is not nearly as bad as the emotional suffering associated with it. That sense of God forsakenness, of their plight, or trying to make sense of their abandonment, asking God, where are you? Some of you might have read the books of Joni Eareckson Tada, telling a time when she broke her neck in a diving accident at the age of 17, way back in 1967. And she has been a quadriplegic since then. For the first few months, she was in utter depths of despair and was often tempted to abandon her faith or even attempt suicide. But since she had no control over her body functions, she was unable to carry it through. And then one day it occurred to her that Jesus knew exactly how she felt. After all, when he was nailed to the cross and experienced excruciating physical pain and lost the ability to move. And this realization was a turning point in her attitude over what had happened to her. And for her, that moment changed everything. From the depths of a Nazi death camp, Dutch Christian Corrie ten Boom wrote, "No matter how deep our darkness, he is deeper still." You see, God's ultimate answer to suffering isn't an explanation, it's the incarnation. Are we broken? He was broken for us. Are we despised? He was despised and rejected of men. Are we sorrowful and grief-stricken? Well, he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Do people betray us? He was betrayed by a friend for 30 pieces of silver. And you might be struggling with illness, family problems, financial difficulties, bereavement, some depressive illness, divorce, unemployment, or 1,001 other hardships. You might have asked, where is God? Or why me? The answer to our suffering is not a bunch of words. It is the word. It is not a tightly woven philosophical argument. The answer is a person, and the person is Jesus. Let me just come into land with a piece of prose entitled The Long Silence. Billions of people were scattered on a great plain before God's throne. Some of the groups near the front talked heatedly, not with cringing shame, but with belligerence. "How can God judge us?" said one. "What does he know about suffering?" snapped a brunette. She jerked back her sleeve and revealed a tattooed number from a Nazi concentration camp. "We endured terror, beatings, torture, death." In another group, a black man lowered his collar. "What about this?" he demanded, showing an ugly rope burn, lynched for no crime other than being black. "We have suffocated in slave ships, been wrenched from loved ones, toiled till death gave us release." And far out across this plain were hundreds of such groups. Each had a complaint against God for the evil and suffering he permitted in his world. How lucky God was to live in heaven, where there was no weeping, no fear, no hunger, no hatred. Instead, what did God know about what humans had been forced to endure in this world? After all, God leads a pretty sheltered life, they said. So each group sent out a leader chosen because they had suffered most. There was a Jew, a black person, an untouchable from India, an illegitimate person, a victim of Hiroshima, and one from a Siberian slave camp. In the center of the plain, they consulted with each other. At last, they were ready to present their case. It was rather simple. Before God could be qualified to be their judge, he must endure what they had endured. Their decision was that God should be sentenced to live on earth as a man. But because he was God, they set certain safeguards to be sure he could not use his divine powers to help himself. Let him be born a Jew, they said. Let the legitimacy of his birth be doubted so that no one would know who really is his father. Let him champion a cause so just but so radical that it brings down upon him the hate, condemnation and efforts of every major traditional and established religious authority to eliminate him. Let him try to describe what no man has ever seen, tasted, heard or smelled. Let him try to communicate God to men. Let him be betrayed by his dearest friends. Let him be indicted on false charges, tried before a prejudiced jury, and convicted by a cowardly judge. Let him see what it is to be terribly alone and completely abandoned by every living thing. Let him be tortured. Let him die. Let him die the most humiliating death with common thieves. As each leader announced his portion of the sentence, loud murmurs of approval went up from the great throngs of people. But when the last had finished pronouncing sentence, there was a long silence. No one uttered another word. No one moved. For suddenly all knew God had already served his sentence. What is God like? The God that we love and serve is the God who is revealed through Jesus, the one who chose not to escape suffering but to endure it, to sit where we sit, and to experience what we experience.